Thursday. The Thursday is the day that I used to go, me and my sisters together in my parents' home. All what I want now is to have one Thursday day, to have it again and to live it again. I just want to go back to that day and to live it. I want to hold my mother and never let her go again. Yeah, I miss Thursday so much.
October 6th was a Friday where I used to go to the market in the morning to bring necessities, supplies for my family, then preparing myself to Friday prayer at the mosque. I remember that day there was a small party in the evening to celebrate the engagement of my cousin's daughter. It would be our last time experiencing such joy.
Nagham Hanna and Rakan Abdulrahman described their last moments of normalcy in Gaza before their lives changed forever. Nagham and Rakan are correspondents for The National and continue to cover the war there a year later, something they did not expect they would still be doing today. They are among 2.1 million Gazans who have seen death, destruction, hunger, and suffering every day since that early Saturday morning on October 7, 2023.
I was in Gaza City when the war broke out on 7th of October. It was Saturday, and it's supposed to be a normal day, just to let my kids Umar to go to the school and to go to my parents' home to take the breakfast with them. But we woke up suddenly at the sound of launching rockets.
Suddenly, I heard loud sounds of explosions and saw a barrage of rockets in the sky. I had no idea what was going on. I thought that Israel might assassinate a senior Hamas official, and this is a retaliation from Hamas. I had no idea what was going on for over an hour until reports started coming in that the barbed wire fence that separates Gaza from Israel was breached.
Israelis woke up today to find their worst nightmares had come true.
Israel caught off guard after the largest and deadliest escalation of violence in decades.
Early Saturday morning, Hamas rockets streaking overhead as people celebrated and danced. And when that infiltration, that large-scale attack happened, Hamas militants came right into the center of this town. We saw wild videos of them opening fire on civilians.
So many Israeli casualties from the massacre at that music festival. More than 260 bodies recovered from the scene. We're hearing from witnesses.
Around 6:30 that morning, thousands of rockets were fired into southern Israel. About an hour later, in broad daylight, Hamas's armed wing and other armed groups broke through the wire fence along the northern border of the Strip, launching an attack that came to be the biggest security breach in Israel's history.
Palestinian gunmen are inside Israeli towns and cities, and they are fighting running gun battles against Israeli forces trying to regain control.
Gunmen stormed across Israel's southern border near the Gaza Strip on foot and by air using motorized paragliders to sweep into several border towns, taking soldiers and civilians hostage.
Festival goers seen in videos circulating online, running for their lives, desperately fleeing for safety.
It so happened that on that morning, hundreds of people were attending a music festival in the heavily militarized zone on the outskirts of the fence that keeps Palestinians confined in Gaza. Hamas fighters parachuted in on makeshift gliders and rode in on motorbikes, gunning down seemingly everyone and anyone in their way. The scenes were violent and bloody. People were running for their lives as chaos, panic, and fear took over. In the next few hours, the fighters would infiltrate several Israeli towns near the border, entering homes and taking families captive. By the time the Israeli military intervened, it was too late. About 1,200 people were killed, and at least 250 more were taken hostage into Gaza. As the scenes unfolded in Israel, so did they on screens across the region and the world. In those moments, one question loomed. How will Israel retaliate? How horrific, how brutal will the response be?
When seeing the news footage, it became clear to me that Israel's response to besieged Gaza will be substantial and the upcoming war will differ from previous one.
At that time, I was sure that the life will change and we have to prepare ourselves for that.
You're listening to Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This is the first of 3 episodes in our special report, marking 1 year since the October 7 war began. The war that killed more than 41,500 Palestinians and wounded 96,000 others, with at least 10,000 more people missing and under rubble. We revisit the events of that day, but also ask how we got here in the first place. What was the breaking point that brought Hamas's armed wing to take matters into their own hands? And what triggered Israel's unprecedented war of no limits in Gaza and beyond? Our episode features voices and views from Palestinian, Israeli, and American political experts, in addition to accounts from our own correspondents. Israel's military declined our request for an interview after initially accepting, and the Foreign Ministry said it will not be able to participate in this series. Israelis were devastated by the October 7 attack. Families didn't know if their loved ones and children were dead or taken captive. In Israel's border towns, gun battles between Hamas fighters and the army raged for days, while inside Gaza, an anxious caution settled in before the reckoning that was yet to come. On October 9, Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant announced a total blockade of the Strip, suffocating it by cutting off water, electricity, internet, food and aid, a form of collective punishment as described by the UN that Israel said intended to isolate Hamas from its supplies. What happened next crossed the bounds of anything Gazans like Rakan and Nagham had seen before.
I witnessed 4 wars: 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021. The level of civilians and children were killed, as well as the daily terror, is unmatched in comparison to this war.
Of all the horror he endured, Rakan remembers one night very vividly.
In late December, there was a night at war that I will always remember. The Israeli army began shelling the area around 10 or 11 p.m. For 2 hours, literally, these shells did not stop. It was like we were waiting death. Me, my wife, and children were at the same room. So if one of these shells hit the room and killed us, we died together.
Before October 7, life in Gaza was already a struggle. The concentration of its population in a small area and the harsh conditions people were surviving in made Gaza known as the world's largest open-air prison.
Our life in Gaza was not perfect, but we accepted. The electricity is only 8 hours a day, and we accepted. We don't have a great future or a bright future, but we accepted because we were together. But even that, they didn't want us to have. I don't know why. This is our fate as Palestinians, and we have to accept it. We can't ignore it. And we have to give it for our children also, to accept their fate, that we don't have a bright future. We will never have a bright future.
Life before October 7 was awful.
This is Palestinian analyst Taghreed Al-Khudari, who grew up in Gaza.
You have direct Israeli occupation. You have siege imposed on Gaza for many, many years. You have people who are getting opportunities for the most prestigious scholarship, and they could never make it out to the outside world. So they were under that direct occupation that it controls every single aspect of life.
About 60% of the population were already living in poverty, with about half of Gazans unemployed. Food insecurity was already at 80%, forcing millions to rely on 500 trucks of aid every day for their next meal.
on the personal level, I expected an explosion. I expected that Hamas will not stay silent, and also other groups, that there will be kind of something that will come up. Now, something came up that is October 7, but I didn't imagine the magnitude that Hamas will go that direction.
Within Hamas, there's the political arm. Many of those officials reside in bureaus abroad, including Qatar and Turkey. Then there's the armed wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, which operates largely inside Gaza. The two wings may be aligned politically, but they aren't always on the same page in terms of strategy.
And it's extremely clear that it wasn't Hamas as a movement that decided this attack. It was the three people within Hamas, including Sinwar here, that decided this. And that's why it has succeeded, because the political leadership had no clue about it. The thing is, we always knew that there will be a response to that, but at the same time, you have to understand, who are these people within Hamas that went and attack? It's young people. It's young people that Hamas has succeeded to recruit. So because you cannot recruit those people with this determination unless they are so angry at something. And that something is the ugly occupation that cannot be accepted at this century. To recruit these people and to make them believe in the movement is to live the most painful experiences in life, of course. They believe in ending this occupation. They believe that they have a mission to end that siege.
Here's what not everyone knows about Gaza. The majority of its residents are refugees or descendants of refugees of Palestinian families who were expelled from their villages in 1948 during the Nakba by Zionist paramilitary groups that paved the way for the creation of Israel on the historic land of Palestine. Gaza was later occupied by Israel in 1967, along with the West Bank and East Jerusalem. After the Oslo Agreement was signed in 1993, a Palestinian Authority was set up to govern in anticipation of the establishment of a Palestinian state, which didn't happen. In 2005, Israel withdrew thousands of settlers from Gaza. A year later, Hamas won in contested legislative elections, essentially giving it full governance of the area. It didn't take long before Israel imposed a strict siege on the Strip, controlling every facet of life, down to the caloric intake of its population.
If you put a city under siege and a party that won the elections was not, was abandoned, not accepted, not engaged. The world didn't accept Hamas when they won the elections. So they pushed them at that corner. And what to do? Because at the same, Hamas has a dilemma. They were pushed into governing the place as a municipality, let us say, but at the same time, maintaining the resistance agenda, which is their project.
The UN characterized Israel's siege of Gaza as a reoccupation. And under international law, an occupied entity has the right to resist, including by means of armed struggle, under a strict framework of conditions. But Israel and its Western allies, primarily the US and the UK, consider Hamas a terrorist organization. It was no wonder then that in the aftermath of October 7, the mainstream media seemed to be asking one single question.
Do you condemn Hamas?
Would you condemn what Hamas did?
Do you condemn Hamas?
My thinking is that most people haven't a clue what had become of Gaza in the decades preceding October 7th.
I spoke to renowned Jewish American academic and activist Norman Finkelstein. He is not a stranger to this question, having been pressed on it endlessly in media interviews. He is also no stranger to the reality and history of the occupation, having done extensive research on both the Holocaust as the son of Jewish survivors and on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, often drawing links between the oppression both people endured.
So, for those who don't know, it seemed like something horrific that occurred out of the blue. And therefore, if you didn't condemn it, it basically meant that you were not part of humanity. you are some sort of freak. Once you become aware of what Gaza was like before October 7th, my opinion, impossible to condemn the young people who burst through the gates of Gaza on October 7th, though it's perfectly correct as a legal question and as a factual question to acknowledge that crimes of a significant magnitude occurred on October 7th.
With or without condemnation, war crimes were committed that day. The International Criminal Court has already issued arrest warrants for the orchestrators of October 7. Hamas may have not expected the extent of Israel's response, but it must have known it would face unprecedented retaliation. So what compelled the group to cross this line? What were the, quote, extenuating circumstances, as Norman describes it, that pushed them to the brink?
The question is, and this to me is the really pointed question, what options did Hamas have by October 7th? It tried diplomacy, it tried nonviolent civil resistance, the Great March of Return. It tried cooperation with international investigations. It's forgotten now. Each time the UN sent an investigative body after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, after Operation Protective Edge in 2014, after the Great March of Return, each time Hamas cooperated with these investigative bodies, knowing full well they were going to be charged with war crimes. Hamas knew they were going to be charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. They still cooperated. Israel refused to cooperate, including currently with the current International Commission. They refused to cooperate. Hamas was willing to take the risk of being charged with very serious crimes under international law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, because they wanted outside intervention to finally put an end to this. So they tried diplomacy, they tried nonviolent civil resistance, they tried cooperating with international legal bodies, and everything had failed.
Knowing this, and since the Nakba in 1948, the military occupation of the West Bank in 1967, an Oslo agreement that failed in practice, and the 17-year siege of Gaza, was October 7 a surprise attack?
It was unexpected in the sense that there was no prior warning that it was coming, but it was expected in the sense that those sorts of conditions would not surprisingly yield that kind of reaction. And then there's the second aspect, which is the question of, did Israel know about the attack in advance? Well, there the answer I would say is murky. And so much of the Hamas, it is surprising how much of the preparation was being done in broad daylight. That part I don't really quite understand. I don't understand it on the Hamas side, and I don't understand it on the Israeli side. The Israeli side is kind of more understandable because the Israelis treat the people of Gaza like Untermenschen, subhumans, as it was called during World War II, the Untermenschen. So they didn't believe that the Hamas was capable of an attack of that magnitude.
It was a huge failure in 3 levels.
That's Kobi Michael. He's a senior researcher at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies and Misgaf Institute.
First of all, it was a conceptual failure because the leading conception, be it in the military establishment or the security establishment or the political establishment, was that Hamas is deterred due to the fact that Hamas wants or Hamas prefers to improve the standard of living in the Gaza Strip, that Hamas is interested in improving the economy, and therefore, if Israel will assist them to do that, and if some other players will assist them to do that, then they will not have motivation to launch a military attack or a terror attack on Israel. This was a conceptual failure, but there was an intelligence failure, a catastrophic intelligence failure. I think that it is pretty understood that Israel had all the intelligence, okay? The problem was not absence of intelligence. The problem was the interpretation of the existing intelligence. And the third failure was the operational, the military failure, that the IDF along the borders failed operationally to prepare itself and to be in the right operational status in order to prevent the attack, or in order to stop the attack. There is no doubt that this is a huge failure. But on the other hand, the IDF succeeded in recovering and regrouping itself very rapidly, and to move from defense to attack, from defense to offense.
In the days and weeks that followed October 7, residents of the Israeli towns that came under attack began to recount what they witnessed that day. They told local Israeli media outlets like Haaretz and Ynet that they saw Israeli forces attacking some of their own people. Around the same time, reports began to emerge that the army may have also opened fire on people running away from the music festival.
These are things which are still under investigation, things should be learned. There is no doubt that some Israelis were killed by the IDF. I assume at least that some of them were killed by the IDF when the IDF tried to stop Hamas operatives. These are marginal numbers, but most of the Israelis that were killed in the kibbutzim, in the villages, in the towns, okay, before the IDF have reached there. We have to remember that the situation was very chaotic. We are talking about thousands of Palestinians, okay, that invaded and then ran away back to the Gaza Strip.
It's true. The situation, as Kobi says, was very chaotic. But did the Israeli army knowingly kill its own citizens, as widely reported in Israeli media? Norman explains.
The Hannibal directive effectively says, kill the future hostage so we can avoid these hostage negotiations. After Hamas captured Gilad Shalit, probably around 2004, and once they captured an Israeli soldier, it then resulted in this huge negotiating.
It was in 2006, actually, and Gilad Shalit ended up in captivity for 5 years.
And Israel eventually, in order to get Shalit back, had to give up something like 1,000 of its political prisoners, which is easy for Israel because it incarcerates everybody. 1,000 for them is nothing, it's just a day's work. But the Israelis decided they didn't want to go through that again, and that they have the choice between killing somebody who might eventually be used as, what the expression is, a bargaining chip, and just killing him before he becomes a bargaining chip, that Israel implemented the Hannibal directive during the events of October 7th and thereafter. The question is, how many Israelis did the Israeli army kill in the course of implementing the Hannibal directive? Judging from the information we have, and I admit it's incomplete, it doesn't seem to me it could have gone much over 100. But between 11 and 1,200 Israelis were killed on October 7th and shortly thereafter. Of those, 313, the official figure is 313 were combatants. The rest, about 800, more than 800, were civilians, which would leave still about 700 civilians killed by Hamas.
And even if this directive was issued that day, Hamas fighters and other combatants still managed to abduct a significant number of captives. This is unprecedented. It was a big deal and the main trigger for Israel's aggressive military response. It enraged Israeli society, divided politicians in the Knesset, and gravely troubled the international community. Israel's intensive bombing campaign began almost immediately, leveling entire building blocks, killing entire families, and attacking anyone and anything that they deemed to be a hostile target. Scenes of falling bombs and sounds of screams in the night became a haunting reality in Gaza. A ground offensive started soon after, making Gazans' worst fears come true. In the meantime, protests against the war erupted all over the world. Pleas for a ceasefire led nowhere, and against all opposition, even from its closest allies, Israel was dead set on what it said are its main objectives: eliminate Hamas, remove them from power, and free the hostages, exclusively by sheer force. But a year on, none of these things have actually happened. I put this point to Kobe. How far along is it in reaching its goal in Gaza, saying that it wants to eradicate Hamas? We're almost a year on, and none of that goal in Gaza, at least, has not been achieved.
When we say that we want to dismantle the military and the governmental capacities of Hamas, it doesn't mean that we will reach to the last terrorist or to the last RPG. Eventually, we dismantled the military capacities of Hamas in a way that Hamas is not capable to operate anymore as an organized military formation. Okay? Now they turn to terror and guerrilla warfare, and they are very poor in terror and guerrilla as well, although they are still capable to cause damages to the IDF, or even to launch from time to time a rocket here and there and to threat civilians. But generally speaking, they lost most of their capacities. The only thing that they still have is the control over the distribution of the humanitarian aid, something that enabled them to regroup themselves mainly in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. It enables them to continue threatening and controlling the population, and it's something that signals to the local population that Hamas might be an option in the day after the war.
One of the objectives is the release of hostages, but many of the hostages have been killed. How do you categorize, how do you define, how do you describe Israel's failure to release the hostages 1 year into the war?
We know that they are used as human shields for other Hamas operatives in the tunnels, and we still have not succeeded to develop a very sophisticated method or doctrine to distinguish between Hamas operatives and Israeli hostages that are together in a tunnel, and to bomb the tunnel in a way that the bomb will kill only the Hamas operatives without killing the Israeli hostages. And unfortunately, as you know, some hostages were killed by the IDF, because the IDF attacked tunnels, and therefore Israel has to be very cautious in this regard.
And also the other question is, the negotiations were the only things that released the hostages safely. Why do you think that this didn't just be, that the second phase or wave of discussions was not successful? I mean, this was the only way that Israel could guarantee that hostages were released. It's through a negotiation.
This is exactly one of the major reasons to the domestic dispute that we have here in Israel, because I think that the Israeli government, and correctly and rightly, believes that Hamas will not release all the hostages.
Human rights observers criticize the, quote, human shields justification, saying it's being used in Gaza to manufacture consent for the high civilian death toll. When it comes to the hostages, the only time Israel actually managed to free any of them safely without killing civilians in the process was during a prisoner swap in November. At the time, both Hamas and Israel abided by the agreed terms. So why then does Israel insist on using a military approach that has earned it much condemnation? Here's Norman again.
Only about 4% of Israelis, 4% of Jewish Israelis, think Israel is using too much force in Gaza. Only about 4%. And 40% think that Israel is using too little force in Gaza. It should be using more force. And why is that? Because they all instinctively identify with the army. It's a citizen army. Every citizen has to serve. And that, incidentally, is what accounts for the kind of solidarity and esprit de corps. Esprit de corps means the spirit of the group. The kind of esprit de corps of Israelis, the reason why there's no dissent in Israel.
The issue of the Israeli hostages immediately became the dominant focal point for the world, especially in the West. An outpour of support from politicians, celebrities, and influencers stood in solidarity with Israel, with its, quote, right to defend itself. But as the Israeli army pummeled the 365 square kilometer strip with 2,000-pound bunker bombs, and it choked off lifelines, targeted so-called safe zones, destroyed hospitals, and reduced homes to rubble, a very different picture began to emerge. For the first time, the world witnessed a version of Israeli brute force that they had never been exposed to before. People all over the world watched daily, non-stop carnage, hell on earth. 2 million people remain trapped in Gaza, their chances of survival shrinking, while thousands find themselves in front of a decision to leave, to protect their families and children. Our colleague Nagam, who you heard from earlier, was one of them. She has managed to leave to Istanbul with her 2 kids, but the moments leading up to her narrow escape from death were shrouded in uncertainty about whether she and her 2 little boys can ever feel normal again. Her family remains behind in Gaza as it's blown into pieces. Meanwhile, Rakan is still in Gaza with his wife and 4 children. In the next episode, we'll explore how life in Gaza has changed forever and the devastating toll of the war 1 year on.
I forced to move from Gaza City to the south, walking. I walked while I'm holding my 2 years boy, Qais, and Omar was walking in front of me. It was the most humiliation moment I lived in my life.
This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and Dua Farid, who is also our editor. We're audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir.